Third presentation of the morning, Dr. Ricardo Suarez from the JSC. Ricardo will talk about technical inspections of after-treatment devices on passenger cars, and he's a scientific support officer at the JSC, European Commission in Ispra, Italy, and he works on vehicle emissions at the Sustainable Transport Unit. Ricardo, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you. Do we have a pointer by
any
chance?
We had a pointer here. Here.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. So I'm going to move a little bit when we talk about real emission, and not only talking about real driving emissions, but also some other emissions that are taking place in our roads. So I've changed a little bit the title. It's verification of the instrumentation that can be used to detect tampering on diesel and petrol vehicles, focusing on DPFs. So I'm not going to present anything that we have discovered at JRC. I'm going to try to put together some dots regarding the way we can measure, the way we can detect, and the procedure to do this. This is not work that is only done by us at JRC, but for several other colleagues. So the background of the question on periodical technical inspection of emissions of vehicles start with the fact that since the introduction of the Euro 6b, we have standards for particle number emissions from diesel vehicles. And these standards are met thanks to the DPFs. What happened? That recently studies from the Netherlands, Switzerland, Belgium, actually Germany, UK, have shown that up to 10% of the DPF-equipped vehicles suffer from damages or they have just been removed. So at the current stage, so nowadays, how do we test our vehicles in the offices and the check stations? Well, by opacimeter. The opacity is the number that is giving us the pass-fail situation of this car, and this is described in Europe in the Directive 45 or in Regulation 24 in the United Nations level. And as I said, the technique that is used is an opacimeter that measures light absorption. Actually, is described as visible emissions of these vehicles. What happened? Well, basically, these opacimeters fail to detect vehicles that have been tampered or are malfunctioning. And you have here, this is a plot from TNO, a study that they have done. They've been working on this for a while now. And what is going on is that the limit is somewhere of 0.7, so out here. And they plot here what happened of a manipulated car that has a partial bypass that they modulate. And while we are able to see the particles by number, the light scatter is only able to see something, but not to give a fail of this car when we are at very high concentrations. So obviously this brought to the situation where we have to come with an alternative to evaluate these kind of vehicles. And this is done by evaluating the measurement that can be done. Obviously, we've been working for years now with PN, and the DPF was introduced on a way of reducing these particle emissions. But we also have to focus on engine operation. For instance, no road mobile machinery made this kind of test for PN in Switzerland in high idle. But what about low idle? Would that satisfy our needs? Do we need a kind of high idle of high RPMs? And also, we will need to have a plausible pass-fail situation, a limit for this. And obviously, this limit cannot be more stringent than in-service conformity. So we have to relate somehow to the limits that we have nowadays for this kind of vehicles. So having all this in mind, we set up a first set of testing where we took a Euro 6b car with a DPF. We apply a partial bypass of around 10 millimeters, so before and bringing after the exhaust, after the DPF, that we could modify. And we test the vehicle over the WLTP. every time we modify the bypass. And with that car that was hot, then we measure afterwards low idle emissions and raw exhaust compared with the ambient air to see the variability. And we also did some 2000 RPM measurements of that car at that same stage with the car hot. But this time the instruments were kept for the whole period. It was a 60-second measurement for the instruments we would use. At the time, there were no instruments that were meant to be used for this scope. So we just took whatever was in the market that was able of measuring particles. Obviously, when the question comes, are we able to detect particles that are coming from a broken DPF? Well, we had already the PM-PEMs going around, so obviously the answer is yes. Is this the instrument that is going to be used? Well, I don't know. But still, there are instruments, and we had one, an MPET in our facilities. We used that one as an acting reference method, and this was our acting reference method for obvious reasons, and also because we compared it during the WLTP testing in that period with the WLTPs, and the relationship was 0.99, so it was acting very well as a reference. And we also had some instruments coming from manufacturers, as I said, not meant to be used for this purpose, but they were able to measure particles. Texture paper, the P-track from TSI, and a couple of prototypes from Naneos. You see that they use different principles. We have some CPCs based, some diffusion charge based. And for that car, this is how it would look like when we have the bypass closed. So what we are measuring here at low idle, after the car has been tested over the WLTP, is ambient air, which is higher than the raw exhaust measure in that moment, so on and so forth. How it does look like when we open the valve a little bit and measure with all the instruments together. Well, now ambient air is down here, and we see that there are different situations with the different instruments. I know I'm annoying you, but they were not meant to be used for this purpose, and still they follow pretty well the situation when we are measuring. Some of them better than other ones. Some of them would saturate after a while. Some of them are measuring just too much. What happened there? Well, some of the instruments are measuring volatiles. We are measuring solid particle number. So this was an answer for a fundamental question. Are we all measuring the same things here? We have a procedure that could be low idle measurement, or are we all measuring something here that is the same concept? Well, we did the measurements, we saw that there is differences, and we did this kind of measurements for different levels of openness of this partial bypass. And you have the plot here how it looked like. So we have some measurements with a closed bypass, with a little bit open just by the limit of the Euro 6 standards. So close to 10 to the 11, and then we open a little bit further, and then we went to completely open. So a 10 millimeters wide tube that is bypassing. So imagine a hole drilled through the DPF would bring the emissions over the WLTP to these levels. This plot was interesting for us because it's giving us a lot of information regarding where the limit could be set, and what are the needs as well regarding the measurement that we want to do. Because imagine we set a limit around 100,000, and we haven't said anything regarding volatiles or solid particles. This group of instruments here would say we have a fail, while the car might be meeting type approval standards. So fundamental things, not only the instruments per se, but also what we are measuring is essential that we talk the same language. While we were testing these instruments, we got a car that when tested in the laboratory, it was meeting standards systematically. It was below PN emission limits. But it was very, very near to those limits. So I said, well, guys, let me check with the instrument we have here in hand. In this time, I had two PM-PEM systems, the MPET and the Nanomet 3. And let me see how does it look like at low and high idle. Well, ambient air, and this is the sequence, ambient air, low idle, ambient air, low idle, and then we go to the high idle sections. So back again to what is important, in this case procedure. You see that the low idles here, 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 and here are higher than low idle here. This is CGR working. So not only we don't have the situation that we had before where raw emissions are lower than background air, now are higher, but depending on the regime that we are having in the engine, we will have the double amount of emissions from 40,000 to 80,000. So we need to decide where we want to test our cars. Eventually, after a series of tests, the EGR would deactivate what they call the taxi mode. But we have to be sure that we are not measuring one or the other, or we decide to measure after a sharp acceleration activating the EGR, if that's activating. So you see that the sequence of measurements is very stable with the PM, PEMS compliant instruments, that these keep happening. So I accelerate again and it goes back again. And even at high idle, it isn't that bad. You see that the emissions are not that far to be stable. But if we think about doing the testing in 2000 RPM, well, the technician will have to hold the foot still and make the test. And if it's a test that is being done on the roadside where the police stop you and check for this, well, maybe it won't be that trivial. How does it look like? That car that we tested in the laboratory and we measured the concentrations with the MPET at low idle with a deactivated EGR, because all the points that I was plotting before were with the deactivated EGR. Well, it's sitting well in the line that we were measuring before, so it's giving some information. Again, I'm not the first one that has plotted this. The guys from TNO did it with a series of cars before me. I clumsily put here our measurements. If they fit very well, quite well. The tendency is a little bit different. Obviously, if I draw a tendency line with this point up here, it's going to make it straight. But if we focus here, we are in a very good agreement with the other measurements that have been done at TNO. So the campaign wasn't a success, but it was giving a lot of information. We set a second campaign. And now, after a few months, there was a lot of movement. So now we have the people that is producing instruments that have a scope, and they are producing already prototypes that sent to this campaign to be tested at JRC. So now we have our PMP system measuring at the raw exhaust. We also have some measurements down to 3 nanometers. We still have the MPET, the nanomet, paper. Now we have a prototype from TSI, still CPC base, same from Sensors, CPC base, and this time 3 different instruments coming from Naneos, and a prototype from the Czech University, which is based on ionization channels. So now we have a larger set. A lot of them are prototypes, and still we didn't have any specifications for the instruments. So the instrument manufacturers brought what they considered that could be used for this scope. And we made the series of tests, this time though with 4 cars. So with the introduction of PN limits for GDI vehicles, so now these vehicles will also have to fulfill requirements for PN, and maybe they will do it using a GPF, but maybe not. But still, they will have to fulfill it, and they will have to be measured eventually. And so we include a couple of GDI vehicles, one with a GPF, one without it. And vehicle 1 and 2 are the same as they were 1 and 2 before. Instead of doing such a long test this time, we did a shorter one because PTI means that you have to be fast. And let's see if these instruments are capable of giving a good result after just 30 seconds. And then we also did the testing for the high idle part. How does it look like for vehicle 1, the one with the bypass? These are MPET results. Afterwards, I will show you how they relate with the other used instruments, but it's just to illustrate how was the measurement. So at this stage, we had a lot of instruments there. We had the PMP, MPET, and nanomet that were measuring continuously. So that's why you don't see the ambient air now. And the other instruments were measuring in couples. During all these sections. So here we had no bypass or very low emissions or none sometimes. Low idle with the bypass completely open to that 10 to the 12 that I was showing before. And the high acceleration part where a couple of instruments are tested. Then we have the period where they were removed and other two, another set of tests are pretty much this. So even for this car, we had an EGR working in this period that went down. And we definitely are able to see something that is not working properly. So this is how it would look like for the petrol, the one without the GPF. Don't ask me what's going on here. I really still don't know. The car was hot, was coming out from a WLTP test and was left running, and still there are particles coming down here. What it was very important for this GDI is that compared to the diesel cars that we were testing, we have a lot of variability. The emissions are very high, first thing. Well, we have a lot of variability while it should be, while it's burning in low idle. So some food for thought on how we have to perform this kind of test. It's not easy to get it stable, even at 2000 RPM, but we are working on it. How the instruments compare to each other? Well, you have test one is vehicle one with the bypass closed, then we have it completely open up here. We closed it a little bit here, then that's the other vehicle, vehicle two, that met type approval standards, but still had high emissions, then the GPF and the GDR without the GPF. First thing we noticed, well, we managed to see if there is a GPF or not. So all the instruments were able to do that. You have the different instruments that up here, and you see that there is still, this is a log scale, so there is a lot of variability. We have some instruments that are measuring much more. In fact, these instruments did not have any kind of volatile particle removal. Same go for this. But still there are some agreement and disagreement with the other ones. Having a situation where these instruments are well thought to be used for this scope, but as I was saying, for instance, this instrument had a cutoff of 17 nanometers for the particles. So obviously, if there are smaller particles and we compare with PMP, which is 23, well, we might have more. Is this the case? So on and so forth. So again, three things goes together. We cannot set a limit if we don't have a clear procedure, and if we don't speak the same language and we have specifications where the cutoff has to be, whether we use or not a way to remove volatile particles. And again, these instruments will have, say, this car failed the test while actually it's passing. And the instrument is measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. It's not that it's measuring wrong, it's measuring something different. So this is pretty much how they compare. I didn't include the prototype from TSI here because otherwise we wouldn't see the correlation of the other ones. And they agree very well when we go to regression, but they have difference on the concentrations that they are measuring. And the basis is basically what I'm saying to you, that they measure different things. And this is one explanation why. If we don't have a clear specifications, we might end up with a diesel vehicle that a very large part are particles that are smaller than 23 nanometers. You see that for the diesel, it is very stable, not only the measurement of the PMP, which are these error bars, but even over time, because these are the two instruments that we were measuring, and after a while, the other two. And this goes for both. For the GDI, well, we have more variability, but still we have a very large part of particles that are sub 23. Actually, when we measure the size distribution, it were more around 10 or 13 nanometers, so very, very small particles. I don't have conclusions, as you can imagine. I've just learned things through the whole process. And there are next steps that needs to be taken. We've learned that the low idle seems to be robust for the diesel vehicles, so this kind of short test with the proper instrument is going to be able to tell us whether a DPF is broken or is not even there. we also have learned that we have to avoid measuring the volatile fraction. So the instrument manufacturer will have to come, and they've realized of this when we did the last campaign, that they cannot fulfill requirements, so we are not able to succeed in this task if we all don't have the same scope. So the same goes for the size of the particle. Shall be then cut at 23 nanometers. It seems reasonable if we are comparing to type approval limits. Definitely we need more data before we talk about setting a pass-fail limit, and a lot of more study on petrol vehicles. Maybe you are a little bit disappointed because I'm not presenting anything on SCR, and I think we were a little bit too ambitious to think that we were going to come with something here. But it is way more complicated than expected. Thinking about a SCR test, SCR check in a PTI station is not an easy task. We might need to use a small dyno, so are going to have the PTI stations these small dynos, or are all cars wearing an SCR? Are we able even to test a car wearing an SCR over the NEDC? Are we able to activate that SCR to check if it's properly working or not? So we have a lot of questions that are going around. We will still working on it to see how we evaluate the efficiency. So that's why I'm not presenting anything regarding that topic here today. Sorry for that, folks. And thank you very much for your attention.